In the middle of the night, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. A hijacking of 330,306 passengers and crew members suddenly run out of fuel, and the two engines stop running. The lights go out, snow masks fall, and the noise of the engines is replaced by a silence terrifying in total darkness. That huge plane is starting to descend little by little to the ocean. Pilots in shock try to control the aircraft as if it were a glider, in the hope that perhaps manage to make an emergency landing on a remote island in the Atlantic. Cabin crew prepare passengers for a landing, something that in all likelihood would mean the death of all on board. Impact against water in absolute darkness, and with those giant waves I would destroy the plane. Those who survived the impact would likely drown, would die of hypothermia in the cold waters of the ocean, or would be eaten by sharks. Was a real nightmare, but how is it possible? An airliner running out of fuel halfway? Most reports focused on the technical aspects of the incident, but that's only half of the story. The other half is human psychology, decision-making under pressure, and reaction to information. This is the story of Air Transat Flight 236. Stay until the end of this video to find out what happened to the plane and its passengers. The night of August 23, 2001, 293 passengers and 13 crew members boarded a 330-strong. I was traveling from Toronto's Pearson Airport in Canada to Lisbon, Portugal. Was a flight that lasted approximately 7 hours. Most of the passengers were tourists who were going to enjoy the Portuguese for a few weeks. One of them knew that a serious failure in one of the aircraft's engines would put their lives in danger in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Apparently, there was no reason to be concerned. The 330-strong prototype was one of the most advanced aircraft, full of computerized systems that sent information to the pilots through hundreds of sensors. This aircraft, presented 7 years before the incident, was known as one of the safest. And this particular aircraft only had 2 years old. The commander of the flight was Captain Robert Pitcher, 48 years old, who had more than 16,000 hours of flight experience. After loading the aircraft with 48 trillion of fuel to fix that, all passengers boarded, and Flight 236 took off from Toronto at 9 p.m. local time. Everything was going normally. The takeoff was smooth and the aircraft reached its altitude, scheduled 39,000 feet. The first few hours were quiet. Passengers prepared to rest, because they would arrive early in the morning in Lisbon. On long flights, pilots don't have much to do. Mainly check the fuel, monitor systems, and report position to air traffic control, because there is no radar coverage over the ocean. For the first 4 hours everything went according to plan, but just after 5 a.m. GMT time, when the flight was near the middle of the way, the pilots noticed that the number 2 engine, the one on the right side, was showing strange signs. Aircraft systems warned that the engine oil pressure was high. The amount of oil had decreased, and in addition, the oil temperature had dropped. They found this combination of warnings strange, because normally during the flight, oil temperature rises and does not fall. The pilots reviewed the operations manual, looking for an explanation, but found nothing that could justify this situation. Finding no answer, contacted Air Transat Maintenance Center in Quebec, Canada, and sent the data for analysis. The pilots continued to keep an eye on the engine, but no one in the passenger cabin knew about the problem. Many were asleep, but it wouldn't be long before they woke up by a frightening situation. About half an hour later, just past 5:30 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, an alert message appeared on the central screen of the aircraft. The pilots noticed that there was an imbalance between the fuel tanks of the left wing and right wing. This was not very dangerous, but unusual. To solve it, the pilots opened the fuel transfer valve to move fuel from the tank from left wing to right. But only 10 minutes after doing this, the systems indicated that the total fuel for the aircraft had reached a critical level, and it was no longer enough to get to Lisbon. The situation was getting very serious and could no longer reach Europe. In the middle of the mirror, pilots did not have many options for an emergency landing. The only possibility was an airport in the islands. A small group of Portuguese islands in the middle of the ocean quickly changed course there and notified air traffic control that, due to lack of fuel, they had to be diverted. At that time, the aircraft had only 7 of fuel. These numbers may look strange, but 7 was only 06 times 100 of total fuel capacity from 1 to 330, and the rate of fuel loss was much larger than normal. If the numbers were correct, meant that the situation was really critical. The speed at which they lost fuel coincided with a massive leak, but the pilots did not believe they had a fuel leak. On the one hand, during the flight, nothing strange had happened that could cause a leak. Or was there any explosion noise? No strong jolts and no lightning at all. Fuel consumption during the first 4 hours had been completely normal. How it was possible that this almost new aircraft was losing fuel so fast? The captain also requested the flight attendants to look at the wings and engines to see if any liquid came out, but they saw nothing. The rate of fuel loss was incredibly tall, to such an extent that every 5 minutes they lost 1 of fuel, something that seemed impossible. It was very strange that there were only 7 left, being barely in the middle of the ocean, when everything up to that point had been normal. Both pilots came to the conclusion that it will probably fuel indicator displays were failing. Fuel leaks in passenger aircraft are very rare, so much so that one of the pilots had received specific training on how to identify and manage such a leak. Although there is for these situations, they didn't really expect something like this to happen. On the other hand, also came to believe that the warnings related to the engine oil were incorrect. In an aircraft as complex as the A330, sensor errors were not so strange. So when they saw that the fuel indicators gave information that seemed false, thought that these alerts were also errors. But the hard truth was that both alerts were correct. What the pilots did not know was that both the problem with the engine oil as the fuel problem had the same cause. And it was not a computer error, but a huge fuel leak in the right engine. On engine number 2, one hydraulic pipe had come loose, damaging the fuel pipeline, causing the fuel to exit the engine at a frightening speed. This was the real cause of the problems, both engine oil and fuel. A psychological phenomenon known as retention bias played a very important role here. The initial mental model of the crew was that the alerts about the engine oil were false and were caused by sensor failures. When people create an image of the world or a mental model, often behave as lawyers, OT as scientists, i.e. they are looking for evidence to confirm their theory, does not evidence that it contradicts it, even when new signals arrived, as the imbalance in fuel tanks and rapid fuel loss alerts. The pilots could not stop for a moment to reconsider its initial hypothesis. In psychology, it is well known that when people are under stress or high workload, this phenomenon becomes even stronger. The pilots were so busy talking to the maintenance center, completing, coordinating the diversion with the cabin crew and air traffic control, that they did not have time to reassess the situation, although a few minutes before had transferred fuel from the tank from left wing to right wing. The imbalance between the two tanks continued to exist. The reality was that the aircraft was losing fuel at an alarming rate. But for the reasons mentioned above, the pilots still did not believe there was a leak. Although on Tuesday at 3:30 has very advanced automatic systems, there is no specific alert for fuel leaks. The only way to detect it was to monitor the speed at which fuel was being lost of each tank. Contacted the maintenance center guy of Air Transat at that time. The aircraft had only 4.8 T of fuel, when I should be 17 T. During the conversation with the maintenance center, the amount of fuel continued to fall. The pilots considered execute the specific procedure for fuel leaks, but in the end the captain decided not to do so. The captain made this decision because according to this procedure,